computer. And then share. Okay. So this paper is called Toward a Hybrid Theory of Modal and Amodal Completion. These are two phenomena that I'll be discussing in this paper and explaining to you. So the background of this paper is that it is an aim to sort of bring together two distinct traditions of thinking about perception. One is the Nyaya tradition in Indian philosophy, and the other one is analytical theories of perception in contemporary analytic philosophy. So Nyaya perceptual theory offers a form of what's known as relationalist, disjunctivist, direct realism as an account of perception and knowledge. And in my prior work, I have shown how Nyaya perceptual theory can be brought into contact with the work of analytic philosophers such as Tyler Burge, John McDowell, Tim Williamson, and John Campbell. And here, with my co-author Anya, we're going to further that work by bringing it into contact with the work of Bensei Nane, Alex Byrne, Riccardo Manzanotti, and Anya's own work. Okay, so the structure of what I'm going to talk about is first a very brief presentation of Nyaya perceptual theory. And the reason why is because there's actually a lot of detail that's required in order to explain how Nyaya perceptual theory works. And we don't want to focus on those details in this paper and presentation. What we instead want to focus on is a phenomenon that occurs in perceptual experience and how it can be used to argue in favor of one theory versus the other. And then what we want to do is we want to offer a hybrid theory that can answer the phenomenon as a constraint on perceptual theorizing and show how that can be integrated into the Nyaya theory, and in addition with some other novel connections with a contemporary view known as the gerrymandered theory object of hallucinations. So this is a joint effort between Anya and myself. Okay, so the first thing I want to just mention is that it's typical in analytical philosophy to at least distinguish between two types of states of perception. One is called the veridical case, and the other one is called the non-veridical case. And for now, we can just think of the veridical case as the one in which truth is involved, and the non-veridical case is one in which truth is absent. But according to the Nyaya tradition, it's also important to say that some perceptual states might be neither veridical nor non-veridical, but rather they're dubious. And what does this kind of conception amount to? It amounts to an account where you say that veridical versus non-veridical states are ones in which some truth evaluative content is what arises initially in the perceptual experience. There is a cup over there. There is a snake over there. There is a rope over there. There is water over there. Those are assertive sort of judgments that can be part of one's perceptual experience and perceptual judgment. And those can be divided into the veridical and the non-veridical. There's not a cup over there. There is a person over there. There is not a post over there. All of those are cases in which we have some kind of what we oftentimes say as esoteric content, assertive content, because it's truth evaluable. It gives accuracy conditions and verticality constraints. And so the Nyaya theorists oftentimes think that, well, that is correct. The perceptual states can be divided along those lines, but there are also these other states which are dubious. And so what they do is they introduce this notion that we might think of as involving what's known as erotetic content. So erotetic content involves what's known as questioning or inquiry as opposed to assertion. So we might have an erotetic content of, oh, is that a post or a person in the distance? Is that water or mirage in the distance? Where the way in which the phenomenon arises is in the question form, not in the assertion form. So in perceptual state taxonomy, in Nyaya, it's typical to at least acknowledge the distinction between vertical, non-vertical, and dubious. This is not going to play an important difference in the theory we're going to give, but it's important for recognizing at the outset that when people are taxonomizing perceptual states, there may be various ways in which people disagree about what the fundamental taxonomy is of the kinds of perceptual states that we can talk about. Okay, so a key distinction that's found in analytical philosophy is between two schools of thoughts about the nature of perception. One is called relationalism and one is called representationalism. And for the purposes of definition, I'm going to focus on two precise or sort of more subset notions of those notions. So a pure relationalist hold that perception is exhausted by a relation between a perceiver and the objects and properties in the world that are perceived. Okay, and a pure representationalist holds that perception is exhausted by a proximal representation within the perceiver. So what is the kind of difference that's going on in the two cases? Is that a relationalist wants to say that what's really central when you see a person is that there's a perceptual relationship between you and the object, the person as a particular in your environment, as well as the properties that they have. And the representationalist wants to say that the particular thing that's important in representation is that a representation internal to the subject, it's what's produced causally, and that is the main thing that's important. So representationalists favor having representations, and relationalists favor having relations. Of course, you can mix these views in various ways, which some people do. That's not an uncommon thing to talk about. We will be mixing these views ourselves in some ways. But from the outset, I want to sort of begin by talking about a contrast between the pure forms of each of these. So the pure representationalist and the pure relationalist are divided in terms of maybe what we might think of as this sort of exhaustion thesis, this idea that really what's significant and important for talking about in terms of perception is exhausted by either the relation, if you're a relationalist, or the representation, if you're a representationalist. Okay. So both of these views can be brought in contact with a very important thesis about the relationship between veridical and non-veridical experience. So the common kind thesis is that in some sense, having a hallucination of a yellow lemon and seeing a yellow lemon have some common kind of experience between them. Okay, so that's the common kind thesis. Now, the pure relationalists holds that there is no common kind of experience present between veridical and non-veridical perceptual experience. And the pure representationalists hold that there is a common kind of experience between veridical and non-veridical perceptual experience. So representationalists, there's something in common between seeing a yellow lemon and hallucinating a yellow lemon. There's some as-if experience in the hallucinatory case, but there's still something that's going on there that's in common between the two. The relationalists, there's nothing really interesting that's in common between the two states. Okay, so that's sort of the relationship between being a representationalist of a pure kind and a pure relationalist, and this common kind thesis between vertical and non-vertical states. Now, I'm going to make a further assumption in what's going forward, which is that I'll assume that if one denies the common kind of assumption and accepts that perceptual experience is disjunctive, either in virtue of being genuine or vertical, or pseudo and non-vertical, they are a relationalist. So this isn't true of every person who has these views, but I'm going to try and make this inference that if you're a relationalist and a disjunctivist, then in some sense, if you're a disjunctivist and you deny the common kind assumption, then we can infer that you're a relationalist, right? So some people might not make that inference. They might say that I deny the common kind assumption and I'm a disjunctivist, but I'm still a representationalist. I'm going to make the inference that if you're denying the common kind assumption and you're a disjunctivist, you end up being a relationalist. Okay. So now it's important to maybe make the connection here to some of the Indian philosophers. So, for example, Gangesha, who was a later Nyaya philosopher in the Navya Nyaya tradition, what's known as New Nyaya, is basically a disjunctivist. So Stephen Phillips famously said, a non-vertical perception is not really a perception at all, but a pseudo-perception, pratyaksha abhasa, apparent perception, a perception imitator or perception solely from a first-person point of view. You don't really see an illusory snake, you only think you see one. An apparent perception, P, may be indistinguishable from the subject's own perspective from a bit of genuine perceptual knowledge, P, both forming A as F-type dispositions, but Nyaya insists that they are different, taking a disjunctivist position. So based on a lot of intricate theorizing in the view, Phillips, a leading scholar of Gangesha and translator of his major works, has proposed that we should understand Gangesha as a disjunctivist. Now, in this talk, I'm not going to spend time discussing the unique way in which Gangesha is a disjunctivist, but it's very important to understand in general that the kind of disjunctivism that's found in Gangesha is not really the metaphysical disjunctivism that's found in John McDowell. It's not the epistemic disjunctivism that's found in Duncan Pritchard. It's rather a unique form of what I call multi-factor causal disjunctivism, because it's based more on causal relations than it is based on purely some metaphysical thing about the nature of truth or something about epistemology in relationship to the reasonability or a favorability or the likelihood of something being true based on perceptual experience. Okay, because of the assumption I just made, we can argue that Gangesha is a relationalist because he denies the common kind assumption by accepting disjunctivism. So I made that earlier assumption, and I made that assumption so that I could now set up putting Gangesha in the relationalist camp, which I think, even though I'm not giving you textual evidence for this, it's a pretty safe assumption to make that he's a relationalist, a disjunctivist, and a form of direct realist or naive realist. So good. So this gives us a picture of an important Nyaya philosopher, and this locates him as a disjunctivist and a relationalist. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to bring the actual work done by Ben-Say on the nature of perception in relationship to representationalism versus relationalism in analytic philosophy into contact with this ancient Indian philosopher named Gangesha. So Nane in 2015 argues that if we frame the debate between representationalists and relationalists about perception as not being about the nature of perception, but about individuation, we can reconcile these two approaches. So he's sort of saying that when we think about how to understand perception, we can have a debate between representationalists and relationalists. But if we think about what it is to individuate perceptual states, that is to cut them into different kinds of perceptual states, we can actually bring these two views together. So what might seem like a strict disagreement between two camps that doesn't allow for a hybrid view is forced by the way in which the definitions are given because they're focused on perception. And Ben-Say's view is if you switch it to individuation, you can actually bring these views into sort of a hybrid view so that you can have a form of representationalist relationalism where you can see the truth behind both views instead of seeing them as in a strict confrontation with each other. So we agree with this. Okay. In his 2018, he argues that modal and amodal completion are important for everyday perception, and the perceptual theory should be judged based on their ability to explain the phenomena. So I'm going to go very soon into what is this distinction between modal and amodal completion in perceptual experience. But for now, I just want to point out that we strongly agree with this. So it seems to us that in the literature in contemporary analytic philosophy on perception between representationalists and relationalists, they have missed looking at a phenomenon that is prevalent, if not ubiquitous, in everyday perceptual experience, that if your theory can't really give an account of, then it shouldn't be worth considering as a theory of perceptual experience. So this phenomenon is called modal and amodal completion in perceptual experience. And we think and agree with Bensei that more attention and more work needs to be done thinking about how to solve and explain this component of perceptual experience and to figure out how it features in adjudicating whether representationalism, relationalism, or a hybrid view between them is correct. Okay, so in his 2021 paper, he raises an objection to relational theories of perception based on modal and amodal completion. He argues that they cannot explain the phenomenon. So what is the general structure of the argument we're going to get into is he's going to say, well, if you're a relationalist, you really have no hope at all of explaining modal and amodal completion. He doesn't defend that the representationalist has an obvious way to do it comprehensively, but he's at least motivated by the idea that the problem that the relationalist has is not the problem that a representationalist has. And so in that sense, we can say the following: if modal and amodal completion is an everyday phenomenon in perceptual experience that should be part of adjudicating whether representationalism or relationalism is correct, and it turns out the relationalism really has no hope of answering it, then it looks like the representationalist wins the debate. Okay, so we agree that his arguments are convincing in the sense that they need to be taken seriously. However, we think that a hybrid view can be made to work, and our goal is to show how a hybrid view designed along multiple dimensions is going to be used to solve this problem. Okay, so now let's get into the actual phenomenon. So there are two phenomena. One is modal completion, and a way to think about modal completion that Bensei uses and most people uses is from the Kanizsa triangle. So in the Kanizsa triangle, there is, I guess I'm going to try and be neutral with this, there is a sense that you see a triangle, although all the lines in one of the triangles is not present, and all of the lines are continuously not present in the other triangle. So the one where the lines are not present is the one where the three Pac-Mans, as I like to say, in the corners constitute the angles where they intersect in the triangle. And the other triangle beneath it is the one where part of it is occluded by the other image that's presented superimposed upon it. So this is a case where the modality perceiving is completing the object of perception, or at least this is not an uncommon way of describing the phenomenon. I mean, in a little while, I'll talk a little bit about maybe how it is that I'm uncomfortable with some descriptions about what is the visual phenomenology that's going on here. But for now, we can say the following, that there is an object that appears in some sense to be complete, although in a very clear and other sense, it's incomplete, okay? And now one of the claims is that this kind of phenomenon is pretty pervasive, actually. Okay, so then there's another one, which is called amodal completion. So when we see a cat behind a pole, our perceptual system, Bensei says, represents those parts of the cat that are occluded by the pole. Okay, so supposedly the idea here is that you don't see the back side of one cat and the front side of another cat. You instead see a complete cat. Of course, it's occluded by the pole, which the cat is wrapped around, but your perceptual system, I'm not going to use the word represents because Bensei uses that, the perceptual system presents, I'll use that one, a unified cat, okay? And so the claim is, here in modal completion, missing things are put together, and in amodal completion, again, missing things are put together so that a unified thing is presented. In both of these cases, I want to point out that I'm not sure that the visual phenomenology tracks across all perceivers, all human perceivers. So for example, I have a condition known as aphantasia, for which it means that basically you don't really have rich phenomenology in your imagination when you try to imagine objects. So aphantasia is a condition which about 12% of the population has, even though they don't really know it. So I don't know when I look at this object that I see what normal people might see. I don't see a unified cat here at all. I don't actually understand the phenomenon that that Benso is pointing to. And I understand that I might believe that there's a unified cat there as opposed to two different cats, the backside of one and the front side of another. But I'm not sure that I see a unified cat there, right? So there's that seeing versus believing aspect. And so it might be reasonable for me to think, I believe that that's one cat wrapped around a pole, not two cats, the backside of which I'm seeing, the front side of which I'm seeing of two different cats. It's a question between believing based on what is visually presented versus what is visually seen. But the phenomenon in question that's being debated actually is that the representational system, or at least in that talk, is presenting a unified single cat instead of two cats. Okay, so we can talk about that phenomenology later on, but I at least want to just get clear what the basic thing is that is being discussed. And also, again, this is a pervasive phenomenon. So, for example, it's present right now. Gabriella's head is occluding the pillar behind her, holding up the second story of the building, right? So there is some completion going on in my perceptual system about there being a unified pillar behind Gabriella's head, as opposed to an incomplete pillar and sort of Gabriella's head blocking out the incomplete spot, or at least that's the claim that's being made about what's going on. Okay, so those are the two phenomena. Now, again, roughly speaking, this is a way of capturing the phenomenon. We think there are lots of questions you can have about what this phenomenon is. We're going to get into some of them. But for now, I think you have an initial sort of idea that modal and amodal completion is about somehow there being something incomplete in the environment, and it's perceived in some way completely. Okay, so are modal and amodal completion the same? And now we can ask this question from the perspective of neuroscience, epistemology, and phenomenology. So now we're asking a question like, do you really think that what's going on in like the Canisa triangle case is kind of what's going on in what we call the cat pole case? And then we can like divide. Well, there's what would a neuroscientist say looking at retinal stimulation and early processing of vision in stages 1 through 4 and late processes of vision in 4 through 8. Like, what would they say about that from the neuroscientific perspective of engaging with this phenomenon? And there are many studies of this phenomenon. That's another reason why we have to take it seriously. Secondly, though, we can think about this from the discipline of epistemology. Like, do the epistemic factors involving what you ought to believe and what you'd be justified in believing, what you can know, do they change in these two cases because of the way in which the two cases function? Is there something different there, or is it the same? Should we treat them the same? And then from the perspective of phenomenology, which is kind of what I was just getting at, is it really the case that what's going on in the kind of amodal completion, where there's something occluding something, versus the kind where there's incomplete parts in the kinesia? Are those phenomena, do they feel the same to us perceptually, and what are the phenomenological differences? And then, of course, we can put this all three together, like, how does the phenomenology influence the epistemology? How does the neuroscience influence the epistemology? And how does the phenomenology influence the neuroscience? Okay, so we can ask these. It's important to keep that. So Nane maintains that they are treated the same from the perspective of neuroscience. So he's actually laying out a claim that we don't need to individuate these two phenomenon from the perspective of neuroscience, because when we do the neuroscientific studies and we look at retinal images in early and late visual processing, it turns out to be the case that we treat them the same. But again, there's still an issue that we generally make, which is what's the inferential pattern that moves us from the neuroscientific claim to the phenomenological claim to the epistemological claim? So who cares? The neuroscience might treat them the same. That doesn't mean that for most perceivers, they're phenomenologically similar. And when we type phenomenology in terms of classes of similarness, a similarity across bands. The same epistemically, we might have different epistemic judgments about what is warranted in each of these cases. We can't just automatically read that off from the neuroscience. So it could be true that we can treat them the same in neuroscience without it being true that we ought to treat them the same from the perspective of phenomenology and epistemology. We leave this as a question. We're not trying to say Bensei is wrong. We're just trying to say that obviously it's important to look at all three of these and that there are inferential relations about how answering one will affect another. Okay, so now we need to know what is the argument. So Bensei gives a really nice argument, which I think is very well constructed, about how modal and amodal completion destroys the relationalist position and therefore sort of in some sense supports the representationalist position. So he says, in the cases of modal and amodal completion, a relationalist has to hold the subject is related to either the unoccluded parts of the object, cat pole, or only to the present parts of an object, the Canesa triangle, or the whole object. So the disjunction is between parts of an object or a whole object. That's a disjunction. And then in the first disjunct, because there are two types of cases, there are two types of things. It's either the unoccluded parts in cat pole or the present parts in Canesa triangle. But the general disjunction is between parts and whole. So the relationalist can either say you're related to the part or you're related to the whole. The relationalist cannot give a coherent story of perceptual relation when one is only related to the parts of the object. The relationalist cannot give a coherent story of the perceptual relation when one is related to the whole object. There are no other things a relationalist can appeal to other than a relation to the parts of the whole because they're a relationalist. So relationalism cannot give a coherent story of modal and amodal completion. Excellent argument. Divide the space into two possible routes, then show that on each of those routes, the person fails to give a coherent story, and then conclude that the theory is doomed, right? So we agree with the strategy, at least to a certain point. We'll disagree with it in a moment. So let's talk about how he takes care of the first horn of the dilemma. Perceptual experience is explained by the perceptual relation and not by any kind of perceptual representation, premise one. If there is only a relation to the unoccluded or present parts, then the experience of the whole cat is either non-perceptual, involving a belief about the occluded and absent parts, or two, involves mental imagery. 3, both 1 and 2 are inconsistent with the empirical data about how early amodal completion occurs in visual processing, such as that at V1, where beliefs have no ability to play a role, or B, the view ends up being indistinguishable from mental imagery as part of the representational view. So relation only to the unoccluded or present parts fails. Okay, let me explain the argument now with this sort of thing. So if you remember, in the cat pole case, the example I gave, you might think, okay, I'm related to these two parts, the front part and the back part, and a pole, because those are things that your visual system is reacting to at the level of retinal stimulation. Okay, now, how do I get to the view on a relationalist camp that there's only one cat there and not the back side of one and the front side of another, two cats? So one option is the relationalist can say, oh, as I just said, it's not in the visual presentation, it's in a belief. And that belief goes all the way down to the earliest stage of vision in V1 and does something called cognitive penetration. It penetrates through to the earliest stage and converts the retinal image from being just an array about the present parts of the back side of the cat and the front side of the cat and the pole into a representation, a phenomenology of there being a unified single cat. Or there is this relation plus some mental imagery in your mind, and the mental imagery is filling in the details, okay? So he's trying to say the relationalist can only say you have a relationship to the parts. What are the parts there? The back side, the front side, and the pole. So you're obviously missing the unifying part. So how do you get that inside your phenomenology, given that it's not coming through the visual system in terms of the array of what it's interacting with in the part theory. So then what happens is that you either fill it in with a belief or you fill it in with mental imagery. Now, if it is the belief, though, the belief has to cognitively penetrate all the way to the earliest stages of vision. But Bensei reports that studies show that that's too early, that in order for belief to have cognitive penetration, it must occur in something like 3 or 4 to 8 stages of perception, as vision goes from 1 to 8. So it must occur in later vision, but not in early vision. And so because it would have to occur at 1, it's too early, and the studies show that that can't be going on. So the belief response doesn't really help the relationalist at all. Now, if the relationalist goes over to the imagery view, then basically they become a representationalist of some kind. They're no longer a pure relationalist, which I'll get to. They must be some form of hybrid theory. As a consequence, trying to appeal to the unoccluded parts, or in the Canizia triangle, the present parts, the lines that you actually see, and the 3 Pac-Mans, can't really help a relationalist. Okay, so that's the first one. Second one, perceptual experience is explained by the perceptual relation and not by any kind of perceptual representation. If there is a perceptual relation to the entire object, given occlusion, the relationalist needs to specify which object one is perceptually related to. Given that there is underdetermination of the whole object, the relationalist ends up having to say that the perceptual relation is a representational relation. The perceptual object that is one of the relata of this relation is not an actual physical object out there, rather it is a represented object. So relation to the entire object fails. So this argument is kind of the converse problem. So what's going on is they want to say that the relationalist says you're actually related to the whole cat. Okay, they don't tell you exactly how you're related to the whole cat. But then the problem is that if you are related to the whole cat, but you're not seeing the whole cat, then the whole cat is underdetermined. It's underdetermined what is the whole cat. And so how do you know which is the whole cat and what constitutes being related to the whole cat? And so if you claim that the way in which you're related to the whole cat involves anything other than a relationship to the whole cat, you end up being some form of a representationalist again. So in trying to say you're related to the whole cat, you face an underdetermination problem of what the whole cat is based on what you actually see. So given what you actually see isn't the whole cat, what is the whole cat that you're related to, such that you could be related to it? You can't answer that without pertaining to something that's like a hypothetical cat, but a hypothetical cat isn't the actual cat. So you're not related to the actual cat. So this is not a form of pure relationalism. This has got to be a form of representationalism. So relationship to the entire object fails. So now we have 2 horns, either parts or whole. The part one suffers from a problem. The whole one suffers from a problem. Doesn't seem like a relationalist can do any work to solve this because both roads either seem to lead to an improbable theory that beliefs are used, which can't be at visual stage 1, or it leads to something about how imagery or hypothetical objects have to be used, but that can't work either because it's a pure representational relationalist view, so the theory fails. Okay. So that's an interesting, good, nice, well-executed argument. We definitely think it's important and should be part of the conversation, and more attention should be given to this phenomenon. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to concede and sort of present this argument in a way where it might be a false dilemma. So initially I said I thought the argument was compelling, how it was structured. I don't think actually it is compelling because one horn could not actually be true for a different reason that we know from phenomenology, not from neuroscience. It's a well-known phenomenon studied in phenomenology. And that's the idea that we can never be related to an entire object through a perceptual relation. And that's because every object engages in the phenomenon of self-occlusion. The front side of Gabriella's face occludes the back side of her head. the front side of any facing object occludes the other side of it. So if being related to an entire object requires some kind of relation that spreads to the surface area, for example, of the object in its entirety, then it would seem to be that the perceptual relation could never be to an entire object. And that's simply given by the phenomenological fact that all perception is perspectival. It never discloses the object completely, at least in a three-dimensional case. And so if you're looking at like the Canesa triangle, which is a two-dimensional image, you might be thinking about something differently because it's a two-dimensional case. But in three-dimensional object perception, the backside of the object is never revealed. And so it's impossible to talk about having a perceptual relationship to the entire object when we think of that as a perceptual relation that is like a point spread over the surface area of every part of the object. So I think it's a false dilemma in the first place to present the idea that it's either parts or whole. Rather, it seems to be that we're only ever exploring the part option. And because we're only ever exploring the part option, we need to make sense of it in that way. So that's the first thing I want to concede. Okay. Second, I think that it's correct that Bensay wants to put pressure on these pure relationalists and advance pure representationalism in a way, but it's actually not true that one has to accept these views. So the opponents that Bensay is arguing, they seem to accept the idea that perceptual experience is explained by the perceptual relation and not any kind of perceptual representation. That's explicitly part of the argument. He keeps pointing to the fact that if they involved mental imagery, they would be a representationalist. But that sort of makes it clear that it's a dichotomy and not a trichotomy. Why couldn't there be a hybrid view that accepts representationalism as partly explaining things and also relationalism? And in fact, in his own theorizing in 2015, he suggests that there is a way to bring the two views together and show that you can be partly a representationalist and a relationalist when you think about things in terms of individuation and not just a contrast in perception. So we kind of want to block the view that this debate should be explored, given the phenomenon of amodal completion, in terms of just a pure view. So Nene is correct to challenge the pure relationalist, but his arguments might not undermine impure relationalism. They might even support it. Impure relationalism is a hybrid view that mixes perceptual relations with perceptual representations. It is explanatorily useful for three reasons. The neuroscience of perception requires appeal to representations. This is very common when you look at almost all work in neuroscience. The epistemology of perception requires appeal to relations. This is why people say that we don't want to say that someone hallucinates the stabbing of another person is giving us evidence of the fact that they're stabbing another person, but the hallucination shares a common kind with the actual seeing. So if the common kind assumption was all there was to say about epistemology, then hallucinations would be just as much evidence as seeing, and that's clearly prima facie false. The phenomenology of perception requires appeal to both representations and relations. This is something that can be advanced by exploring in more detail what it is to be a representationalist and a relationalist, and thinking about the phenomenology of perception in various cases, especially when you think of perception as something that's locked into sensory motor skills, such as grasping an object. So the relation of perception that's given in vision, for example, has to be related in some way to graspability or sensory motor activity. So there can be an integrated phenomenon where the phenomenology of perception has some relational aspect to another perceptual modality, from vision, for example, to touch or motion around an object. Okay, so just summing up real quickly before I go to pronouncing the kind of hybrid view that Anya and I are going to explore, I just want to again summarize. So two main moves in our argument strategy are, it's kind of a false dilemma to say that there are these two options a relationalist has. One, take the view of being parts or whole objects. That's a false dichotomy because you can never really be related to a whole object. It doesn't even make sense. It's just perception is perspectival. There's self-occlusion of all objects. So what would it possibly mean that you're related to the whole object? Well, it might mean that you can be related to a whole object by being related to a part of it. That's a separate thesis, that being related to part of an object is sufficient to being related to the whole object. I actually personally deny that thesis, but some people like to say that if you see a part of London, you've seen all of London. That seems totally false to me. But in general, the idea that part relation gives you whole relation in perception just seems false. However, it seems more likely that it's just okay to explore the part theory. And in addition, the second assumption that you have to be a relationalist without being any kind of representationalist seems to be part of the exact people who are debating this, but not logically governed by this space. There's no reason why you can't mix representations and relations together. It might even actually be more useful to do so. And if you individuate kinds in different ways, it might even be more satisfactory. So that's the kind of thing that we think we're going to go for. So we're going to pursue the hybrid view. Okay. So there is a hybrid view, and we're going to begin by explaining the hybrid view in terms of certain questions you might ask. So the question you might start with is, what is the object that the subject is related to? Okay, because the standard thing is in representational relationalist debate, the question is, what is the object related to? The representationalist says, well, the proximal object of perception is the representational object, and the relationalist says it's the object in the world that you're related through, right? So the contrast is between the object in the world and the representational object, which is oftentimes thought to be the skin deep object. Like, I mean, no one's going to really say that the representational object is just the retinal image, but it's something skin deep. It's definitely not out there. So that's the difference between the representationalist and the relationalist when we talk about what is the object. Okay, so the subject on this view, on the hybrid view, is related to what we call a gerrymandered object that is constituted by two things: the present parts of the object that are perceived, which would be encoded at some degree in the retinal image, and two, the hallucination of the occluded parts or absent parts of the object. So this is a mixture. It's saying you have this thing that's constructed. Gerrymandered here means constructed. And there are two parts of this thing. One part is what's out there, the present parts that are being perceived. And the other thing is a hallucination. These two things are coming together. So the object on the hybrid view is perceived parts plus hallucinated parts, what comes to be known as the gerrymandered object of perception. Okay, so the second question is, how is the object the subject is related to constructed? Like, it's gerrymandered, so we've already given away that it's parts of a constructed object. But then you might think, well, what is the procedure for the brain and the mind coming together to construct this object? So first, and actually this is done ordinally, meaning that, I mean, this is the order in which we think it occurs. It's not being done just like this is point 1, point 2. The present parts of the object are perceived. Retinal stimulation is highly correlated with that. There is a perception of an absent object or absent parts on the basis of the present parts that are perceived. The perception of an absent object or absent parts triggers the hallucination of missing parts of the object. The hallucination of the missing part is stitched, sewn together with the perceived parts to make a gerrymandered object, part physical and part representational. So again, loosely speaking, fronts, the cat's perceived, the parts you see, then the perception of the absent objects is induced, triggers hallucination, then the hallucinational content is stitched together. I'm not going to give an actual account of what that stitching is. That's a very complicated thing. And that gives you a gerrymandered object. So what is the object? It's a gerrymandered object. How is it constructed? By perception, absence perception, hallucination, and stitching, basically. All right, now let's go through it in more detail so you can see it. Okay, the present parts are perceived, right? It's the first part. Look, you see, I think it's okay for me to say this. Even though I have aphantasia, I think it's okay to say, you see the pole, you see the front side of one cat, you see the back side of a cat, okay? In the other case, you do see lines that pretty much are dark that make a complete triangle, except there's some part occluded by this phased out image. You do see 3 Pac-Mans touching like what would be the vertices or intersecting points of a triangle, but you don't see any lines that are like dark like the other lines that are making the triangle that's inverted, right? So we can say, given a relationalist positions, that you are related to the cat parts, and you are related to the incomplete lines and circles in the second case. Okay, so that's the present parts are perceived. The role of absence perception. Oh, sorry. The absence parts perceived. You perceive the absent middle section of the cat. Okay, so this is a technical claim. So in work done by Anya and I separately, me working in the Indian tradition, her working in the analytic tradition, we have both defended the view that there is a form of perception where absences are what are perceived, and absence perception is an important phenomenon also to be studied in perceptual theorizing. It shouldn't just be that we focus on presences, but we also focus on absences. So we are claiming here in this case that you perceive an absent part of a triangle, of a cat. You perceive the absence of darkened lines in the case of the inverted triangle, and you perceive the absence of parts of the darkened triangle that are occluded by the image superimposed. So in both of these cases, we would claim that there is absence perception going on. Okay. Now, what is the role? In both cat pole case and Canisa triangle case, there is the perception of absence. Okay, and so in the cat pole case, one is perceiving the absent middle section, and in the Canisa triangle case, one perceives the absent triangle, at least, we can minimally say. And now we want to build on this absence perception into something that relates to hallucination, the hallucination parts. So what happens is you hallucinate, rather than have the illusion of, the middle absent section of the cat in amodal completion, and you hallucinate, rather than have the illusion of the lines that make the triangle in modal completion. So hallucinating, so again, it's hard for me to say in the cat case, because I have aphantasia, I really don't know what other normal people see. And I actually had this conversation in Belgium on my fellowship there, where we were talking, and the whole class that I was presenting my arguments to said, you really don't see the unified, you don't see the unified cat. And I'm like, no. And then Benson got really excited and started doing all these little tricks with forks and spoons and things. Hey, do you see this? Do you see? I was like, no, I don't see any. I don't see what you see. So some people see the unified cat. I just really don't see any. I have no phenomenological presentation of that whatsoever, nor any sense of it phenomenologically. It could easily be the backside of one cat and the front side of another. But rather, I don't need to talk about my specific condition or people who have aphantasia. If the phenomenon is real, it's fair to say that you might hallucinate that missing thing. And then the hallucination, importantly, is stitched together with the present parts to make the unified thing. But what's happening is you're hallucinating. And then you might think, well, what's going on in the hallucination? Here, we'll just give a little story for now, and then I'll go into more detail. Well, one thing is, if you have never, ever seen a cat before, or a creature that looks anything like this, who knows why we would say you had a unified experience of a cat upon seeing the front part of this and the back part of that. So because you have seen cats in the past, or creatures like this, like maybe a jaguar, somehow hallucinating the missing part isn't that hard, because what you presently perceive is sufficient to trigger, based on your prior experience, the hallucination of the missing thing. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on in this hybrid view, but I'll get into some more detail. In both cat pole case and Canisa triangle case, there is hallucination. In cat pole case, one hallucinates the absent middle section. In the Canisa triangle case, one hallucinates the contours that make the triangle. Okay, making sense of the role of hallucination in the count. So now it might be important to tell more of a story. A standard account of perception, illusion, and hallucination. Okay, this is like what a lot of people think. In successful perception, there are objects that are successfully perceived, such as when a rope is perceived as a rope. In illusory perception, there are objects that are unsuccessfully perceived, such as when a rope is perceived as a snake. In hallucinatory perception, there are no objects that are successfully or unsuccessfully perceived, such as when there is a hallucination of a snake or a rope against a wall. So this is common discussion in, if not most if not all, most, and especially in contemporary talk, about what we mean by the word hallucination. So what we mean in the case of perception is like the success in a certain way. And in illusion, we mean success, failure in a certain way, but success in another way. And hallucination, what we mean is double failure, right? So in the perception, it's object capture and vertical presentation of the object. In hallucination, it's object capture and non-vertical presentation of the object. And hallucination, it's failure of object capture and anything vertical, right? So it's double failure. Hallucination is the failure to capture even an object, right? So this allows us to then say, in a certain sense, that what makes hallucination different from perception and illusion is that it's unsuccessful in the sense that it has no objects. There are no objects of hallucination. Okay, so recently, really recently, there has become a monumental challenge to this view. I'm not saying it's correct, but a theory of perception and hallucination that wants to claim that this is the incorrect view of hallucination. It's called the Goth theory, G-O-T-H, which stands for the gerrymandered object theory of hallucination. It was defended by Alex Byrne from MIT and Riccardo Manzotti from the University of Milan. And I actually had the pleasure of discussing this both with them in Sicily this past year. And we had a very interesting discussion about the nature of this theory. And so I just want to present part of what their theory is. Neither Anya nor I are accepting all of it, but we think it's important to discuss a new theory and how it might bear on these questions. So in contrast to the standard view, Byrne and Manzotti hold that there are objects and hallucinations. They are gerrymandered objects. Their view holds the following. If in successful and illusory perception, there are objects that are successfully and unsuccessfully perceived because of object dependence, and the particularity of objects in experience, then hallucination, there must also be objects, hallucinatory objects that explain object dependence and the particularity of hallucinatory experience. Just as a particular rope is successfully perceived or unsuccessfully perceived in an illusion as a snake, a particular rope or snake is hallucinated, not a generic rope or a snake. So this is a very subtle point that's important, which can be illustrated by if you just think about a hallucinatory experience, especially of a person. So suppose you're so the example from Indian philosophy is that a person, in Jayanta Bhatt it's discussed, a person recently lost their lover, and out of desire and craving for their lover, they hallucinate their lover against the wall. So in this case, your hallucination isn't of a generic person, it's of a particular person. You're hallucinating a particular person from your past experience. So Byrne and Manzotti want to focus on this object dependence of particularity and say that this stretches across perception, illusion, and actually a hallucination. Just as in a perception, there's a particular yellow lemon you're looking at, and in an illusion, there's a particular snake you're seeing against the background of seeing a rope. In a hallucination, there's a particular object, such as a particular lover, against the wall that you're hallucinating. Okay, so they're going to use this to say that this particularity in object dependence can lead us to the view that shows that the standard account is false. In fact, hallucination, just like illusion and perception, has objects. So this is part of the argument they give. They say seen is the thesis in successful and illusory perception, a certain sort of proposition, a seen is present and thereby determines the way things seem. So a seen is present, and that determines how things seem phenomenologically, right? So the seen is Gabriella's head blocking the pillar behind her, holding up the second floor of the building with an array of bricks holding down the first floor enclosement, right? That seen is present and thereby determines the way things seem to me. Object. If seen is true, Scenes in successful and illusory cases are object dependent. There's a particular head of Gabriella, a particular pillar, and a particular wall with a particular array of bricks. Okay, scene star. In hallucination, a certain sort of proposition, a scene is present and determines the way things seem. For example, in Jay Hundebutt's case, the hallucination of the lover against the wall that's dead. And the presentation of the hallucination of the lover against the wall determines how things seem. Object star. If scene is true, scenes in hallucinatory cases are object dependent. So there's a parity argument. If it works in the one case, it works in the other case. Conclusion, there are hallucinatory objects. So that's the Byrne-Manzotti view against the standard view of hallucinations. So they further say that the hallucinatory objects are spatiotemporal gerrymandered objects that exist. So first of all, just a general claim that we can talk about spatiotemporal gerrymandered objects. This is a little bit of not perceptual theory. This comes from the metaphysics of objects. So, I mean, the example that I oftentimes like to talk about is what happens when you have a glass, like a champagne glass, and you drop it and it shatters, right? So some people might say, well, there's the glass, and then there's a shattered glass, but the shattered glass isn't an object. The glass is an object. If you have a gerrymandered object of spatial relations, you might say that, no, the shattered glass is an object at a given time in space. It's just that its spatial parts are not co-located the way the glass was at an earlier time. So that's spatial gerrymandering of an object. Now they're adding another dimension, which is very important to their case, because in perception, we want to talk about the role of memory. So the idea is that what's going on is that you can have temporal gerrymandering. So temporal gerrymandering is like perceiving something 10 weeks ago and having it in memory, perceiving parts now, and then the brain merging the temporal thing from the past with what it's seeing now. That's temporal gerrymandering. Put these two together, you can have a gerrymandered object that's spatially and temporally constructed. So sometimes hallucinators are aware of diverse spatially, temporally scattered objects that appear as one. So something is appearing as one in their hallucinatory experience, but what it is a spatially temporally scattered object where temporal parts from the past and space come together through the brain, stitching together what's going on in the present moment with what you perceive. They say the gerrymandered object theory of hallucination holds that there's always an object of hallucination, and that object is always a physical object, but sometimes it's not ordinary. Sometimes it's gerrymandered. And what it makes it gerrymandered but still physical is that the parts spatially and temporally are always physical objects, either from the past, the present, or located continuously, like in the champagne glass before it shatters, or discontinuously when its shattered parts are on the floor. So you either have continuity in space, discontinuity in space, continuity in time, discontinuity in time, but more importantly, in both those cases, you're having a physical object that you're interacting with. And then what happens is the stitching goes across the space and the time, okay? So according to Goff, awareness of a hallucinatory object is typically enabled by a jumble of different episodic memories of different objects. Good, okay, getting close. Okay, so the gerrymandered object theory via presence and absence perception applied to modal and amodal completion. So what we're doing is we're taking this theory and we're now going to apply it to the form of modal and amodal completion to generate a hybrid theory as an account. So in modal and amodal completion, the subject is related to the unoccluded and present parts of the object. The subject perceives an absence. The subject has hallucinatory perceptual projection that is in part due to memory and the perception of an absentee. The entire object of perception is a gerrymandered object that is the union of either the unoccluded or present parts of the object and a hallucinatory perceptual projection onto an existing occluded region of the object in the visual field or the location of the absence. Just take the cat pole case. So you perceive the front side of the cat and the back side of the cat. On the basis of that, you have an absence perception of a missing part. The absence perception triggers from memory the perception in time back then of an actual physical cat that's a complete whole. The cat that was a physical whole has its middle section taken out, and it's hallucinated and projected into the contemporary experience and stitched together to make a gerrymandered object. Okay, so that's one case you can do it with. Okay, so now we're going to just close by modifying both Nyaya and Byrne and Manzotti's theories a little bit. So on our view, both Nyaya and Goth need to be modified a little bit. So Nyaya rejects all use of representations in their perceptual theory. However, their rejection of representations is due to the fear that representations create a loss of contact with the world. This is mostly what direct realists are concerned with. But our use of gerrymandered objects is both relational and representational, so there's nothing to fear. And additionally, there's a way to solve the problem of modal and amodal completion that goes beyond saying when we are in relation to a part, we're also in relation to the whole is a part of. So we think it's okay to say that although classical Nyayikas would have denied that we can have any form of representation as part of the view, it's okay to modify the theory to be a form of impure relationalism that has some representations going on. For example, the role of the hallucinatory projection. There is a question about whether or not the Nyayikas need to accept any representational content in order to actually account for modal and amodal completion through using the gerrymandered object theory of hallucination. But I'm going to just basically say that even if they can do that, there might still be other reasons to say that they don't have to be pure relationalists. Okay, so Goth maintains that the objects of illusion are always physical objects, sometimes ordinary, sometimes gerrymandered. We modify this account for our purposes to allow for it to be applied to cases of modal and amodal completion, where there's a need for both relations and representations. Gerrymandered objects need not be completely physical, but they must have some physical parts, right? So what we've said is basically the cat, front side you're seeing and back side you're seeing, those are the physical parts. But the part that you stitched in from a prior experience was a physical object in the past. But that projection into the current case isn't the projection of the actual physical part from the past. It's a projection from memory of a representation of what that physical part looks like. Because if I was to project that part from the past, wouldn't I just move the whole cat from the past into the future? That doesn't seem to be plausible at all. But my memory can recall that I saw a unified cat and there was a representation of this part. I can have a representation of this part of the cat, and that representation can be stitched in through hallucination with the present parts. Okay, so what we're modifying is that where Goth wants to say it's always physical parts, spatially and temporally discontinuous, perhaps, and gerrymandered, we want to say that the stitching can occur between physical objects and representations, right? So representations can be part of what's stitched together with a physical object. The brain is a lot more complex machine than we want to imagine. It doesn't always need physical objects. So that's what the modification is. Okay, so maybe there's a way to advertise our theory in relationship to some other common phrases. So Anil Seth and Andy Clark are famous for saying that perception is controlled hallucination. All perception is controlled hallucination. What it is to see the world correctly is to have a hallucination that's controlled in various ways. Byrne and Manzotti like to flip it around and say hallucination is just what happens when perception is uncontrolled. And I think Anya and I want to say veridical presence and absence experience and non-vertical presence experience are intertwined in perception. So there's a way in which modal and amodal completion can bring out the way in which, given their pervasive phenomenon, that presence and absence experience are interweaved together in the construction of our visual experience. Thank you very much.